Who created the modern America First movement? The political establishment will say Donald Trump. Who built the religious conservative voting bloc? They will say Ronald Reagan. They are wrong. Both movements were engineered decades earlier. They were built by a woman who called herself a simple Midwestern housewife. Her name was Phyliss Schlafly. To understand her massive influence, you must understand her ultimate weapon. She used the element of surprise. In the media, Schlafly played a very specific role. She cultivated the image of a mild-mannered mother of six. She wore perfectly pinned hair. She wore pearl necklaces. She even began her speeches by thanking her husband for letting her come. It drove feminists absolutely insane. But it was brilliant political theater. Behind the pearls, Schlafly was an intellectual powerhouse. She held a master's degree in government from Harvard. She put herself through law school. She was a razor-sharp constitutional expert. She even authored technical reports on nuclear defense strategy. She didn't stay in the kitchen much. She was too busy test-firing machine guns at a World War II ammunition plant to pay her college tuition. She simply used the image of the kitchen as a distraction. It allowed her to walk directly onto the political battlefield. And her very first target wasn't the political left. Her first target was the elite leadership of her own Republican Party. Exposing the kingmakers. In the early 1960s, the Republican Party was deeply divided. The conservative grassroots lived in the Midwest and the West, but the actual power was controlled by the Eastern establishment. These were wealthy, moderate Republicans from New York and New England. They controlled the money, they controlled the media, and they completely controlled the presidential nominations. Schlafly looked at this power structure and decided to destroy it. In 1964, she wrote a small 123-page book. It was called A Choice, Not an Echo. Traditional publishers refused to touch it. So, Schlafly set up a publishing company inside her own house. She printed the books herself, and she mobilized local women to distribute them directly out of their car trunks. The book was a masterclass in political warfare. She exposed the wealthy elites and the political insiders. She famously called them the secret kingmakers. She revealed how they met in smoke-filled rooms to handpick compliant nominees. She argued these elites were terrified of actual America First conservatives. She demanded the party finally offer voters a real choice, not just a watered-down echo of the Democrats. The establishment laughed at her, but the grassroots didn't. The pro-American underground. A Choice, Not an Echo, became an absolute sensation. By the 1964 Republican National Convention, over 3 million copies were in circulation. Her self-funded network completely bypassed the mainstream media. The book shifted the momentum of the entire convention. It helped Barry Goldwater rip the nomination directly from the Eastern elite. Goldwater ultimately lost the general election, but Schlafly had proven something incredibly dangerous. She proved she could mobilize voters entirely outside the traditional system. The elites had the money, but the conservative grassroots had the numbers. Schlafly began organizing her readers. She called them the pro-American underground. It was a highly motivated network of local housewives and mothers. They communicated through newsletters and phone trees. She quietly built an invisible conservative army. They were loyal to her. They distrusted the media, and they were ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. The Republican kingmakers thought they could just ignore her, but Schlafly was just getting started. She had built the exact machine she needed for her next fight, because the 1970s were approaching, and the Equal Rights Amendment was about to give her the perfect enemy. The unstoppable force. In 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment seemed unstoppable. The media loved it. Hollywood loved it. Both political parties aggressively backed it. The amendment passed Congress with massive, overwhelming bipartisan support. We are talking about 84% of Senate Republicans voting in favor of it. President Richard Nixon officially endorsed it. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter completely supported it. Within just 1 year, 30 states had already ratified the amendment. It only needed 38 states to become a permanent part of the U.S. Constitution. At the time, ratification wasn't viewed as a political battle. It was viewed as a pure formality. The feminist movement had won. The political establishment had won. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't account for Phyliss Schlafly. And they certainly didn't account for the underground army she had been building. The Bread Makers' Rebellion. In late 1972, Schlafly launched her counterattack. She founded an organization called Stop ERA. Stop wasn't just a command, it was an acronym. It stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges. This was a brilliant tactical flip. Feminists argued the ERA would grant women equality. Schlafly argued it would strip away their legal protections. She warned the ERA would force women into the military draft. She said it would abolish alimony and child support. She even predicted it would lead to unisex bathrooms and same-sex marriage. The mainstream media mercilessly mocked her. Feminists called her ridiculous and paranoid. But her arguments resonated deeply with working class and religious mothers. And then, she deployed her most famous tactic. The feminist movement protested with anger, disruption, and marches. Schlafly protested with charm. She deployed her army of housewives directly to state capitals. They didn't carry angry, shouting signs. They brought homemade bread, jams, and apple pies. They handed these baked goods directly to state legislators. Attached to the bread were polite, handwritten notes. They read, "To the breadwinners, from the bread makers." It was absolute psychological warfare wrapped in a pie crust. The male legislators absolutely loved it. The feminists were completely outmaneuvered. And suddenly, the unstoppable momentum of the ERA hit a brick wall. The death of the ERA. The momentum didn't just slow down, it completely collapsed. By 1977, state ratifications came to a dead stop. 5 states even voted to revoke their previous support. The political establishment panicked. Congress did something entirely unprecedented. They voted to extend the ratification deadline to 1982. They thought they just needed more time. They assumed Schlafly's housewives would eventually get tired and go home. They were dead wrong. For 10 straight years, Schlafly's army relentlessly lobbied state legislators. They dominated the phone lines. They completely neutralized the massive feminist lobbying machine. On June 30th, 1982, the final deadline arrived. The Equal Rights Amendment officially died. It fell 3 states short of the 38 needed to change the Constitution. Phyliss Schlafly hosted a massive victory gala in Washington, D.C. She served a giant cake shaped like a tombstone. Written in icing across the top was RIPERA. She had done the impossible. A Midwestern housewife with a self-published newsletter had defeated the entire political and media establishment. The Equal Rights Amendment was officially dead. The hostile takeover. Most activists would have taken the victory, packed up, and gone home. But Phyliss Schlafly didn't demobilize her army. She didn't just want to defeat the liberal agenda. She realized the incredible power of the network she had built. She pivoted. She looked at the Republican Party leadership. The elites still controlled the party apparatus. They were still socially liberal. Many still supported abortion access and the broader feminist agenda. Schlafly decided it wasn't enough to just win one political battle. She decided to change the core of the Republican Party. In 1980, the Republican National Convention was held in Detroit. The elites thought they were in charge, but Schlafly's army of housewives completely flooded the committee rooms. They didn't just bring homemade bread this time, they brought demands. They out-organized the establishment. They forced the GOP to completely drop its decades-long support for the ERA. They inserted the very first anti-abortion plank into the official Republican platform. They demanded that strict family values become the absolute center of conservative politics. The country club establishment was horrified. But a candidate named Ronald Reagan wasn't. Reagan looked at the massive, highly mobilized voting bloc Schlafly had built. He embraced her platform. He rode that new religious conservative coalition to a historic landslide victory. Overnight, the power dynamic shifted. The Republican Party no longer belonged to the wealthy Eastern elites. It belonged to the grassroots, the original anti-feminist. But Phyliss Schlafly didn't just understand political mechanics. She understood a fundamental rule of warfare. Politics is downstream from culture. You can't just fight for the law, you have to fight for the mind. While country club Republicans were obsessed with marginal tax rates, Schlafly was waging a massive cultural counterinsurgency. Long before the modern internet, she was the original anti-feminist. She didn't just disagree with the feminist movement, she sought to completely dismantle their core philosophy. She laid out her arguments in two explosive books, Feminist Fantasies and The Flip Side of Feminism. In these books, she refused to play defense. She went entirely on the offensive. She argued that feminism wasn't a liberation movement at all. She called it a massive, destructive lie that ultimately made women miserable, alienated men, and damaged children. Let's look at three of the most dangerous concepts she exposed. The daycare secret. The first major lie she attacked was the institutionalization of children. Feminism pushed the idea that women could have it all by simply outsourcing motherhood. Activists demanded federally funded, universal daycare so women could immediately return to the workforce. Schlafly attacked this narrative without mercy. She argued that no government bureaucracy or low-wage daycare worker could ever replace the psychological bond of a mother. She warned that putting children in institutionalized daycare for 40 hours a week had severe, long-term negative effects on their development. The mainstream media and the feminist lobby completely buried this argument. But she wasn't the only one sounding the alarm. More than a decade later, Warren Farrell, the author of The Myth of Male Power, would echo this exact same reality. Farrell pointed out that the psychological damage of separating children from their parents for the majority of their waking hours was one of the best-kept secrets in modern culture. The empirical data proved the harm, but the political establishment refused to acknowledge it. Schlafly argued that forcing mothers to hand their infants over to strangers wasn't empowerment. It was a societal tragedy disguised as social progress. The corporate trap. The second major lie was the illusion of corporate liberation. Feminism taught young women that true independence meant abandoning the home to become a full-time corporate employee. Schlafly called this an absolute scam. She asked her audiences a very simple, cutting question. Why is taking orders from a corporate boss considered liberating, but taking care of your own family considered oppression? She relentlessly pointed out the massive hypocrisy of the feminist platform. Feminists told women they were victims of the patriarchy if they stayed at home. But they were actively pushing those same women to become overworked wage slaves in a sterile corporate environment. Schlafly argued that traditional marriage was actually the ultimate protection and privilege for women. It allowed women the profound freedom to raise their own children, manage their own homes, and be financially supported by a dedicated provider. She warned that feminism was tricking an entire generation of women. It was convincing them to trade a life of deep family meaning for a lifetime of exhausting corporate burnout. The war on men. The third lie she exposed was the manufactured war on men. Feminism didn't just demand legal equality, it demanded a permanent enemy, and they made men that enemy. Schlafly wrote extensively about how the movement was actively destroying the fundamental relationship between the sexes. She argued that men and women were not perfectly interchangeable widgets. They were fundamentally different, and those biological and psychological differences were designed by nature to be complementary. By constantly demonizing masculinity, feminism was destroying the cultural expectation of male provision and protection. She warned that treating men as inherent oppressors would backfire spectacularly. It would lead to a generation of completely alienated, directionless men and deeply unhappy, unprotected women. She argued that women didn't need to be protected from men. They needed a society that actively encouraged men to be strong fathers, reliable providers, and loyal husbands. Her cultural arguments were completely unapologetic. They made her the most hated woman in America among the liberal elite. But while she was fighting this massive cultural war, she was still maneuvering on the political battlefield. Which brings us back to the Republican establishment. The Long War. The Republican elite thought they had figured out a trick. They thought they could adopt Schlafly's family values talking points just to win elections. And once they were in power, they could go right back to their country club globalist agenda. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the GOP leadership shifted. The Bush dynasty and the neoconservatives took control. They pushed for massive free trade deals like NAFTA. They championed open borders and globalism. They expected Phyliss Schlafly and her housewives to quietly fall in line. They didn't. Schlafly rebranded her Stop Era Army into a massive network called the Eagle Forum, and she turned her weapons entirely on the establishment right. For 30 straight years, she was an absolute thorn in the side of the Republican elite. She published a relentless monthly newsletter. She warned her followers that bad trade deals would gut the American working class. She argued that unchecked immigration would destroy the American middle class. She warned against fighting endless foreign wars. The media called her outdated. The Republican elite called her a nuisance. But they were completely missing what was actually happening. Schlafly wasn't just complaining. She was strategically building a highly weaponized, purely populist America First platform. She was keeping the conservative grassroots organized and totally alienated from the establishment elites. She had built the perfect engine. She was just waiting for the right driver. The Kingmakers versus Trump. Fast forward to the year 2016. The Republican establishment was in a state of absolute panic. A brash, populist outsider named Donald Trump was tearing through the primaries. The media called him a joke. The Bush family and the party elites were desperately trying to stop him. But a 91-year-old Phyliss Schlafly saw exactly what was happening. Trump wasn't talking about globalism or polite country club conservatism. He was talking about closed borders, ripping up bad trade deals, and putting America first. He was speaking the exact language Schlafly had taught her underground army to speak 50 years earlier. While other conservative groups hesitated, Schlafly made her move. In March 2016, she walked onto a stage in St. Louis. She gave Donald Trump her full, absolute endorsement. She told her millions of followers that the establishment was completely rigged. She declared Trump was the only candidate who could finally defeat the secret kingmakers. It was the ultimate, full-circle moment of her entire political life. She poured her final months into writing one last battle manual. It was a book titled The Conservative Case for Trump. Phyliss Schlafly died on September 5, 2016. She was 92 years old. Her final book was published the very next day. She didn't live to see Donald Trump win the presidency 2 months later. But she didn't need to. The political establishment she hated had been beaten. The America First grassroots army she built was now in charge. and the simple Midwestern housewife who couldn't get her first book published had successfully defeated the Republican Party.